The Trudeau Liberals recently offered up $252 million to our country's agriculture sector. That includes beef processors like Cargill. As one of our biggest trading partners, the United States is facing a beef shortage. To talk more about it is one of our regular contributors, Brian Lilley, joins us from Toronto via Skype. Now, Brian, $252 million. I talked with Lethbridge MP Rachel Harder. She says, really, that's crumbs. They need more like $2 billion for a handout right now.
Yeah, the industry was asking for about $2 to $2.6 billion, depending on which sector you were talking to or which sectors. I mean, it's a multifaceted industry. Lumping all farmers, all agriculture producers, all sections of agri-food together is quite simply ridiculous. And you heard that as you talked to various sectors. This is a real problem. And the day after the Prime Minister offers $850 million to the World Health Organization, to help find a vaccine, offering $252 million to Canada's farmers to help with the problems they're facing does seem a bit like chump change. Look, I'm a fiscal hawk, but this is a government that has spent so fast, Hal, that we're now facing a deficit of $252 billion. I'm old enough to remember not that long ago when that was the entirety of the federal budget. And really, it's well over 50 to 60% of the federal budget now. So why just $252 million? We're looking at about $77 billion to help with getting PPE into the system. We're looking at $50 million to buy up food that might go to waste otherwise and then distribute it to people that need it. All these are good things. But we're talking about an industry that, if it's not handled properly, could result in food shortages. I don't know if you've seen, but the New York Post had a headline the other day. It said, "Where's the beef?" Why? Because Wendy's, who made that line famous back in the 1980s, is running out of beef. And a good chunk of their restaurants now have to take hamburgers off of the menu. So the line that started in the 80s as a shot at McDonald's for their burgers being too small is now coming back to bite Wendy's because the American food supply chain isn't working the way it should. Are we going to face that problem in Canada? Well, industry experts that I'm talking to are saying, look, right now, probably not. We're kind of facing a glut when it comes to meat protein, be it beef, pork, poultry. There's a bit of extra in the supply. And in fact, when it comes to beef, a lot of the cattle can't be taken off the fields. They can't be taken out of pasture or even sent to finishing yards because there's no way to process them yet. But come summer, we could end up facing either a shortage or we could be facing big price increases. So there are problems on the horizon for the meat industry in Canada, for the agriculture industry in particular. I spoke to one farmer, normally plants about 900 acres of broccoli, but given the way things are going right now, he's worried if he'll be able to get even half of that into the ground this summer.
Brian, some provinces are slowly opening up their economies, including here in Alberta. I can finally go in for my chiropractic adjustment. But most Canadians say they're okay with this slow way that the premiers are relaunching their economies.
Yeah, an awful lot of people say, you know what, go slow, we're fine with that. I do have to wonder, though, how many of those people are retirees or civil servants who, for them, it doesn't matter. And, I've spoken to a couple of pollsters and asked them, are you able to get me information on that? Are we talking about people whose livelihood relies on getting a paycheck from the private sector? Or are we talking about people who are, well, not overly reliant? Look, simple fact of the matter is across Canada, only about 62% of the public are actually in the workforce. When you look at how big the public sector is, the broader public sector, when you include teachers, nurses, doctors, police officers, everyone else, people that face no risk of being laid off, you're down to about 30% of the population. Well, in some cases, that's the percentage saying we need to open back up because they're reliant on a private sector paycheck. So I've asked for that information. We don't have that yet. In this case, though, I will point out, Hal, that it's about 50% in Alberta that are saying go slow. That may be because of recent spikes in cases in Alberta, including at the Cargill plant in High River, where people are saying, okay, maybe not yet. Or, maybe it's also in Quebec where they had a couple of bad days of numbers and the province there was slated to reopen schools and retail stores next week. And now in the Montreal area, their epicenter, they put it off by another week. So, there's a lot of factors at play here that we don't quite understand yet.
So, despite the fact that economies are slowly reopening, the Prime Minister is still encouraging people to stay home.
Yeah, he's saying don't go out unless you absolutely have to. That's probably not what someone like Brian Pallister wants to hear. The Premier of Manitoba almost threw the doors wide open for their economy reopening on Monday. Most sectors were allowed to get back to as close to normal as they can. Social distancing rules still apply. All of that, people being encouraged to wear masks and take other precautions. But they have the most wide open economy right now. Now, Manitoba, not a lot of cases there. Also, not a very big population. Same with Saskatchewan next door, which is going a bit slower. But when you look at the big population centers, whether we're talking about an Alberta, a British Columbia, Ontario, especially, or Quebec, the premiers are going a little bit slower, but they are still reopening. And it's funny to watch the Prime Minister try and act as if he has some kind of say in this. He didn't have a say in the provinces shutting down their economies, and he definitely doesn't have a say in them opening back up. He has tried to get them all to agree to some basic principles and try and say, well, these are the federal rules for reopening. But let's be honest, those rules that they put out in a joint statement are so banal that everyone would agree to them, which is why all the premiers did agree. And even without federal help, they would have said, yes, you can only reopen when it's safe, and you've got to make sure that workers and customers and businesses are safe. We don't need the federal government telling us these things, and we don't need the federal government telling us to stay home. I guarantee you, Hal, even as things reopen, people will be much more cautious than they were before in terms of how often they go out, when they go out, and how they act when they are out in public.
Now, Brian, here's a shocking story. A top Liberal volunteer in Vancouver says anyone who breaks the rules around social distancing should be shot, but not shot with one of the guns which has been talked about being banned, right?
I don't think he cares what type of gun they use, and we'll get to the gun ban in a couple of minutes. But yeah, this guy's name is Mark Elias, and he's been in trouble before for some outrageous comments, and he still remains president of the Vancouver East Liberal Association. He was speaking on social media and saying that he agrees with Filipino President Duerte in saying, if you break any kind of curfew, you break the rules around staying home, you should be shot. This guy actually called for people to be shot on sight. How do you remain the head of the Liberal, he's not the president of the Liberal Association of Lethbridge. He's, downtown urban elitist Vancouver, and he remains president there. This guy's got to be shown the door if the Liberal Party wants to hold any kind of moral sway as they continue this debate.
Any kind of credibility, absolutely. Now, Brian, let's talk about that gun ban. Many Canadians are not happy about it, saying it'll do nothing to address the serious issue of illegal guns crossing the border and gang violence. And you've spoken to premiers who are also against it.
Yeah, premiers Kenny, Moe, and Ford all came out against it last week. I did ask Premier Pallister about it. Did not hear back. Police chief in Calgary has spoken out against it. The chiefs of police have said that you don't need this sort of thing, and yet the government's going ahead with it. Before we get into the minutiae, Hal, of what type of gun is actually being banned, let me point this out to you. The federal Liberals promised $327 million over 5 years to fight guns and gangs, and that includes gun smuggling at the border. Now, we all agree that we want guns and gangs to stop. Okay, so they've promised $327 million over 5 years. Only $86 million of that goes to stopping gun smuggling at the border. Yet when it comes to buying guns from legal licensed gun owners who aren't shooting up the streets of Calgary, Lethbridge, Ottawa, Toronto, Vancouver, or anywhere else, they're going to spend $600 million. That's their estimate. And just like the gun registry, that number will go up. So they're going to spend far more than double what they will spend on fighting guns and gangs with people that are actually causing the gun violence than they will, to buy back these guns. And they're using the tragedy in Nova Scotia, which was not committed with legal guns, was not committed by a licensed gun owner. It was committed by someone who, just like the gangbangers, turns around and imports guns from the United States. This is messed up beyond belief, and it targets the wrong type of guns. The C7 that I trained on in the Canadian military back in 1990 is banned again because it was never legal, but it's on the list. You've never been allowed to buy that as a civilian.
Let's go back to chatting about COVID-19 for just a moment here. One of the things we've been told is that we need better testing when it comes to the coronavirus to get society somewhat back to normal, Brian. A promising Canadian test has been pulled over recently because of concerns it's not working properly. Can you explain?
Yeah, this is the Spartan Cube. This was the one that everyone was hopeful of. You know, the Americans have their 5-minute to 15-minute test from Abbott Laboratories, and we were hopeful that we had to get something. Abbott is not selling this test anywhere but the United States at this point. They don't have the capacity to fill the orders. The United States government is taking up all the capacity they have to produce their quick test, and we need something. If we want to be able to open up, if we want to be able to test high-risk populations, going into workplaces, be it long-term care centers or that Cargill plant in High River, we need something that doesn't take 2 days to get a result back. And so this Spartan Cube was produced by a company, a biotech company out of Canada in the west end of Ottawa. You remember Ottawa, Hal? The west end is a high-tech hub. There was all sorts of hope for this. The Alberta government had placed orders. The Quebec government, Ontario government, the feds had promised millions for it. And then it started, before most provinces had even started rolling it out, Quebec started to experience problems with the test not delivering accurate results in their long-term care facilities. Now Health Canada has put it on hold. We don't know if or when it will be back up. The company is saying by summer. That may be too late. So we need something, and we need it quick.
One of the big questions is, how did the virus hit the world stage? There are now questions about whether it was in countries outside of China a little bit earlier. In fact, there was a report that a man in France tested positive for the coronavirus back in December.
Yeah, this is a guy who showed odd symptoms, and they weren't quite sure what it was in late December. And they've gone back and they've retested cultures that they had from him because, they did a swab test to say, okay, what does this guy have? Just like when it first showed up in China, it was initially described as an odd pneumonia-like condition. So they didn't know what this guy had. He's a man in his 40s. He's since recovered, had no history of travel. Well, they said they've run the test multiple times and that he has tested positive for COVID-19. So did it originate there? Did it originate in China? Did it originate in the wet market or the lab? We don't know where this thing came from. But I can tell you this from my own writing, my own experience, Hal. As we discuss this, once you say that it may have started in the Wuhan Institute of Virology, the lab where they study coronaviruses in bats, they've got a woman there. She's known as the Bat Woman. She's a scientist who goes into caves, collects bats, and then studies the viruses they have. When you suggest that it leaked out of there, it is immediately dismissed. Why? Not because Chinese scientists posited this in late January, early February, not because the State Department had suggested this in cables earlier, but because about 3 weeks ago, Donald Trump said, oh yeah, I've heard of this. I'm hearing more about it. So, my take on this is we can't let how someone feels about Donald Trump, positive or negative, determine the science. We've got to look at all the evidence and follow where it leads. We can't say, well, we won't look at that because Orange Man is bad and, if he said it, it can't be true. That's not how science works, and it would be a shame if we did it here.
The Trudeau Liberals have been slow to criticize China over COVID and other issues, and they're now mum on the status of Hong Kong protesters seeking asylum.
Yeah, about 46 democracy protesters from Hong Kong have put in to become refugees, the political asylum seekers here in Canada. And the government so far has not welcomed them with open arms. I mean, it's a lot harder for these democracy protesters. And we saw what it was like in Hong Kong, the pitched battles in the streets, the oppression imposed by the regime in Beijing on people in Hong Kong. Well, you would expect that they might just say, okay, let these people in. No, they are facing far stricter measures than the people that have simply been walking across the border for the last 2.5 years. To my mind, it's a bit ridiculous. Asked to speak about this, Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland did say, and she's right on this, that she can't speak about the specific cases, but she also wouldn't speak out in favor of the democracy movement in Hong Kong at the time. She did say that she believes in the one country, two systems, which has long been what the international community has supported, that Hong Kong is now part of China, but they have two different systems. That was good to hear. But neither she nor the rest of the government is standing up for these democracy protesters who say they will be persecuted if they're forced to remain in Hong Kong.
Brian, we have about a minute left here. Now, there are calls from Ottawa and a Liberal MP to see the oil sands shut down in Fort McMurray. Tell me more about that.
Well, there's a lot of calls for that, but one of them that I've been hearing is Marie-Claude Bibeau. She is the agriculture minister who's behind this $252 million rescue package for the agriculture industry, but she's part of what I dubbed the Mud Hut Brigade of Trudeau's cabinet. That would include Catherine McKenna, the former environment minister, John Wilkins, the current environment minister, Stephen Guilbeault, the heritage minister, and I'm told that, Bibeau doesn't actually show that much interest in agriculture and helping farmers. Her main preoccupation at the cabinet table is talking about how we end the oil industry and shut down the oil sands in Canada. We always knew there was a strong section of that, which is why it took so long for even the meager package that came out to help the oil industry on Alberta, why it took so long for that to come out. But to find out that the ag minister spends more time on that, according to some colleagues, than she does on dealing with issues related to farming and the agri-food sector, that's more than a little disappointing.
Wow. One of our regular contributors, Brian Lilley, joining me once again from Toronto. Thanks so much, Brian.
Thank you.
On behalf of all of us here at BCN, I'm Hal Roberts. God bless. Thanks so much for watching.